Hello, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. We're thrilled to have you here for our webinar today on innovation in government. My name is Jeff Gothelf. I'm going to tell you about myself in just a second. With me today are Hana Schank and Sara Hudson, who will show themselves as well here in just a second. They are the authors of Sense and Respond Press's latest book called The Government Fix, all about innovating in government, which is available now on Amazon. And we're super excited to have them here sharing their insights with us about how to do innovation in government. As we get started, and I wanted to share with you a little bit of information about us and our authors and presenters today, and then we'll jump right into it as well. So again, my name is Jeff Gothelf. I'm one of the co-founders of Sense and Respond Press. We publish short, practical business books for busy executives. We've been doing this series of webinars with all of our authors for a while now, and we'll be recording this one as we've recorded all the ones before and then sharing it on our YouTube channel as well. So if you've got some colleagues who can't make it or couldn't dial in today, know that we will post this on our YouTube channel, hopefully within the week or within a week at least. The authors we have today, like I said, wrote a book for us called The Government Fix, a fantastic book on how to do innovation in government and what you should know about that, but probably don't know about innovating in government. The authors we have today, who I hope will turn their cameras on here in just a second, are Hana Schank and Sara Hudson. Hana is a public interest technology fellow at New America. She was previously a director at the United States Digital Service at the Department of Homeland Security and has worked in government at both the city and the federal level. Prior to moving to the public sector, Hana ran a user experience design and research consultancy for 15 years. I feel that, having been in that field myself for at least that long. She's a frequent contributor to the New York Times, The Atlantic, and the author of 2 books, including The Government Fix or in addition to The Government Fix?
In addition to The Government Fix.
So 3 books. Excellent. Sara Hudson is a PhD is a writer, researcher, and public interest technologist. She previously led teams at the Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, the City of New Orleans Office of Information Technology and Innovation, and the Department of Justice. A FEMA-trained emergency manager, she created NOLA Ready, New Orleans Centralized Emergency Response Systems post-Katrina, and subsequently led New Orleans emergency communications response and data triage during disasters and public safety incidents. That's amazing as well. Fantastic. Hana, Sara, thanks so much for being with me and the folks here today. There's a ton of people on the webinar already interested in hearing from you. Just really quick, where are you all? Where in the world are you both today?
I am in scenic Brooklyn, New York.
Nice. Sara?
And I'm in not very scenic Washington, D.C.
Excellent. Right on. Cool. And I am across the ocean in Spain, and so in Barcelona, which is totally scenic, although a little gray today as well. So we've got a nice distribution of folks on the call today. Listen, folks, as we get started, this is the way these things work for us. Sara and Hana are going to do a short presentation, maybe about 15 minutes or so. You'll notice there's a Q&A module at the bottom of the webinar interface. I encourage you to put your questions in there throughout their presentation and the conversation that we have following the presentation. I will be sharing those questions with Hana and Sara as time allows to kind of, once they've completed their presentation, so that we can continue the conversation based on what you want to know, what you heard, maybe whatever questions that you currently have. So Q&A module, and I'll remind you about that in the chat as well. If you're tweeting about this particular webinar, we do have a hashtag. It's hashtag Government Fix, which is the name of the book, Government Fix. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, we are recording this and we'll share the recording on our YouTube channel shortly. I'm going to say within a week, and hold myself to that deadline shortly. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Hana and Sara to start the conversation. Again, put your questions in a Q&A module, and I'll come back on once they're done, and we'll start to kind of follow through with some of those questions as well. Okay, Hana, over to you.
Great, thanks, Jeff.
Yep.
So thank you, everybody, so much for joining us. We're really excited to talk about what we have learned over the past year and a half, 2 years. So we, as Jeff mentioned, we recently published a book called The Government Fix. And for those who haven't read it, which I'm going to assume is the majority of people since it just came out, we wanted to share some of the big points in the book, and then also some things that are not in the book that we've learned about government innovation. So we began researching what would become this book about 2 years ago. We had both landed at New America, which is a think tank in DC, which was starting a group focused on the building of a field that they were calling public interest technology. Feel free to call it something else. One of the first things we found is that people don't call it public interest technology, but for the sake of brevity and being concise, we will call it that throughout the course of this webinar. So we were interested in understanding what the public interest technology landscape looked like across the country, in part because we had both come out of efforts at the federal level to do innovative things in government and had found them somewhat messy and confusing, but also in part because we're researchers by trade. So if someone says, hey, there's a new field, our first reaction is to say, is there? Is there really? Are you sure? We're going to have to research that and verify that. So researching a thing that doesn't have a name, that people don't know what it is, can be a little bit tricky. So we started there we go. So we did a round of initial interviews, as you do. And then we sat down for a synthesis session to just figure out what we were hearing. And since we, I think, have a more design and research heavy audience today, I'm going to nerd out just a tiny bit on our process and how we got from interviews to findings. So first we pulled key snippets from each interview. We put the key snippets on index cards and pulled out keywords for each quote. And then we grouped cards based on the primary keywords. And then we, of course, broke out the sticky notes. And then at the end of doing all of that, which took about a day, we sat back and made a list of, well, having done that, what do we know today that we didn't know yesterday? And then finally, we took a look at who the audiences were that we wanted to reach. And then we did the whole thing again with more interviews and more data, and sort of cycled through that a bunch more times. And then that amazing thing happens that happens in research happened to us, which is that you realize that you've totally been asking all of the wrong questions. So we had been asking people about tactics for getting the work done from everybody, from people who we thought had everything all figured out. And we had this realization that it turns out nobody has it all figured out. So we had to shift how we were thinking about the information that we were gathering and also what our output was going to be. However, we did start to see some patterns. And this is the other wonderful thing that happens with research is when, you know, 6 people all use the same phrase to describe something, or have all had the same difficulty with something. So today we're going to share 5 key things that we heard that we think that a lot of innovation teams should know but don't. Whoops. Okay. So the first and perhaps the most important is that innovation requires championing from the top. And I'm going to go through these briefly because we want to have time to cover everything in Q&A. So feel free to ask more detail around examples as we go. And there are examples of that in the book. But for now, I'll say that we did not see a team that was able to be successful without somebody at the top who was saying this is important. So typically what that looks like is somebody like the mayor, city manager, CTO, or CIO feels that things must change and gives people permission to operate differently. The second is that there's no best when it comes to team structure. So interestingly, we knew that there were a lot of different models that people were using, and we thought we'll figure out which is obviously works the best. And in fact, a lot of our interview subjects asked us, so we're using this model, which model have you found is the most successful? But what we found is that in part because this field is so new, but also in part because there are a lot of different things, there are different pros and cons to different team structures, that there wasn't really a best. There were several different models, and I will not take you through each one, but suffice it to say, as I said, there are basically pros and cons for each one. The main thing that we found about this was that the last two don't work. The last two are a great way to drive everyone to rage quit. And that's hiring a really smart, fancy person or accidentally hiring somebody who wants to make change into government. So I'm gonna, and I'll turn it over to Sarah for the next set of findings.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. So the third thing that we found was success rarely looks like superheroes or blockchain or drones. Sometimes it doesn't even look like technology. For a long time when the media covered government innovating or problem solving, we saw the same storyline over and over. It basically went superheroes parachute in, superheroes deploy superior thinking, money, skills, superheroes save backwards / broken government, introduce an Avengers level media style blitz. But as we talked to practitioners to ask them to tell us about their successful projects using tech, we found that people had a huge range of stories and named a whole bunch of different things as their favorite moments. And what almost none of them looked like was superheroes that parachute in, deploy superior thinking, save the backwards of broken government, and then there's a media blitz. So what we came to understand in talking to folks is that success can look a lot of different ways, and often it doesn't look the way that outsiders might expect. It rarely looks like blockchain. It rarely looks like, and if you actually mention blockchain to people, they will probably groan. So sometimes it actually looks like policy. Mobile's a great example. There was a data-driven innovation team that started out on Instagram taking pictures of blight and ended up changing a property law that dated back to 1901. Next slide. Sometimes it looks small. In the example here, this is as small as 3 lines on an FAQ. We heard that actually tons of times there was the things that were the small wins that sat atop the weeks and months and sometimes even years of effort and stress and work to make changes that would have deep impact on people's lives. So in this example, this is 3 lines on a public website that helped hundreds of thousands of people trying to travel internationally every year. And before those 3-line changes, they were getting erroneous information that would have sent them to the TSA, when they went to the TSA pre-check, that would actually not set them up for success when they tried to travel internationally. Next slide. Sometimes it actually doesn't look like success at all. So we live at this point in a world where technology reporters are breathless for AI and Bitcoin. And in everyday life, we're kind of blasé around programming our whole lives from the stuff that we keep in our pockets. We actually need new definitions for what quote unquote innovation means when it comes to government. It's not shiny and it's often not big, but the impact is. So these are some of the examples that people shared to our question. Can you tell us about a favorite moment of success you've had? And one thing I want to call out here is innovation in government is often as much about people and processes and policies as it is about products. And so sometimes the first wins to improve external service delivery are actually internal mindsets and process flow shifts. So it's really easy to be, be jaded and, take the last bullet and say, great, bureaucrats are talking to each other. The broken government is what? A hair less broken. But it actually undermines the effort and the time and the size of wins that something as simple as sounding like, say, getting multiple city agencies on Google Sheets or just getting people to answer your telephone call can be. Next slide. So one of the things next, too often the success that gets celebrated or asked for is shiny success. Next. And because the variety doesn't surface, it doesn't get celebrated. So one of the things we heard most often from practitioners is that it's really important to recognize the smaller successes too, not just for the outside folks, but actually for practitioners themselves, so that they can start to see and feel the value of the really hard work they're doing every day. Next slide. So number 4, although success we saw came in many forms, we were actually surprised to see that problems are not just finite, but folks are solving the same ones. So as we started piling up stories of problems solved or ones that people wanted to solve and hadn't heard yet, we started hearing not just patterns, but often the same stories. In Mobile and Alabama, there were civic technologists or public interest technologists trying to solve the same problems that were caused by blight. In North Carolina and in California, we heard people solving the same problems around returning citizens trying to come home and restart their lives after exiting the criminal justice system. In Washington and Rhode Island, Washington State and Rhode Island, we talked to different folks working on the same problems around child welfare and the journey map to become a foster parent. In Alaska and Las Vegas, we had people solving the same problems of poorly designed official government notices that nobody would open. And in Syracuse and St. Paul, one of my favorite problems, the perennial problems of potholes. So while we started to realize that success comes in many forms, we were seeing finite problems and we started to group them. Next slide. One of them, anybody who's worked in government will probably not be surprised, procurement. For most people, government procurement is an unknown term or the most boring thing in the world or both. Next. But it's actually a perfect example of not knowing what questions to ask when we got started. Next. We asked no one questions about procurements in our first round of interviews, but everyone gave us at least one answer that involved problems caused by procurement. Next. Why? Next. Because it's so often the root of the work that people can't do, both the work that is impeding them from doing their work and often the first problem they have to solve. So we heard from folks that when they talked about both their biggest successes and failures, stories tended to start with procurement and end with procurement. Next. So then we started to group problems and we found that they came in what we called 2 major forms: verticals, which were common service delivery problems. This were things like child welfare, blight and code enforcement, affordable housing, infrastructure, homelessness, public works, EMS, emergency response. And then across the verticals, we had common horizontal problems that will probably sound familiar to many of you, regardless of what vertical you might work. This is things like coordinating across departments and agencies, or procurement, of course, hiring talent, and knowing when to build solutions in-house versus use something that actually exists that somebody else has built. Next slide. Number 5, government problem solver practitioners are leaving. So one of the things that we were startled to find is that in this world of solve problems and improve government service delivery, we were not surprised to find that there's dedicated and passionate and talented people, but the work is really hard and the career opportunities are murky and the resources are hard to find. And we started to realize months later that we had to continue to add questions because people were leaving. As we started to publish pieces, we went back to interview people again and found actually that a lot of them weren't still in the field. Next slide. Harlan Weber summed this up really well in one of our interviews. He said, it requires a lot of effort to be connected. Most of our jobs are delivering things for others, but it's hard to stay connected to each other. As somebody who wants to start doing the work or keep doing it, it's really hard because there's not an easy way to Google people solving problems like blight or how to get people into how to streamline emergency room forums. If you're a lawyer, you know where to go. If you're a civic tech / public interest tech / problem solver in government, you don't even know what to call yourself. So we found then that people really were seeking a couple of major things: connections to each other, access to solutions for problems that other people had already solved, and group therapy. So just some important background context. Most folks date this field to about 2010, 2011, and the rise of the government digital service in the UK. It means that one of the things that we're fighting right now is just that there isn't a lot of infrastructure that's been put into place. We don't have multiple conferences. We don't really have centralized journals. We don't have mentorship tracks where you can go to the person who had your job before, because lots of times you're in the job that never existed before you had it. We did see that then people have specific problems that they're tackling. They want to share stories of work. Conferences are now the default place for group therapy, and there wasn't really single places that people knew to go to get information. Next slide. So we did what good quote unquote technologists do. We asked people about their problems. We prototyped some first steps to address them. We shipped some beta projects and products, and now we tested and we tweaked and talked to people, and we're continuing to iterate. Next slide. So a couple of interventions we made. First, we made a thing, specifically a practitioner newsletter. It's called The Commons, and each month it's a newsletter that focuses on new topics that have come up, like getting the work done or hiring or ethics. And by the way, if the group therapy need resonated, the next issue is on stress and challenges. And if you have a story you'd like to share, we would love to hear from you. Next slide. And then we met people in person, shared learnings and feedbacks. For anybody who's in the field, you won't be surprised that included the Code for America Summit. We've also done talks at places like New America, where we're housed, and at conferences. Next slide. And of course, we wrote this book, plus a bunch of other articles and columns in places like the Washington Post and Fast Company, Slate, GovLoop. But really, at the end of the day, we were so excited when Jeff came forward and sent some response press, because we wanted to begin to provide examples and consolidate knowledge and point the way forward, and to show that the work doesn't have to be hard, and you don't have to fly somebody in from Silicon Valley to fix all the problems. You just have to want to do things differently. So next slide. On which note, we would love to hear from all of you. So I'm going to kick this back over to Jeff for some Q&A.
Nicely done. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Good. Really interesting and entertaining. Look, I have to tell you, I'm biased. It's true. But, you know, when I was reading your manuscript, I was so impressed at how, how fun it was, right? So, you know, government, every interaction with government feels like a slog, you know, and it feels like nothing ever gets done. But your book was fun, on point, lots of tactical stuff in there, lots of things to take away. And I loved reading it. Look, so questions are coming in here, and there's a bunch, and I want to encourage folks to jump in the Q&A module. There's already at least 6 or 7 questions in here already. And so I'm going to start to work through them as best as I can. Plus I've got a few of my own that I'd like to ask. Let me start with this first, and then I'll kind of move in here as well. So we're talking, at least it sounds to me like you've done this work at a variety of different levels. I'm curious what the differences are between innovating at the local, the state, the federal levels. Is there a significant difference here?
So I can start with that. So as I mentioned, we had both come out of federal level efforts, although we had also worked at the city level. And I think so actually our initial plan was to speak to federal people because that's who we knew in part. But as we started branching out and talking to more people who are at the city and local level, and I will say that I omitted state there because there are a few state efforts that are starting up now, but when we started this research, there was pretty much one. We started to see that the federal level is kind of its own beast. And there are a lot of municipalities that are struggling with the same things, and as Sarah talked about, solving the same problems. And so the overlap between that became a little bit more interesting. I would say that one thing that we've observed is that it's easier at the city level. Sorry, city people who feel like, which is not to say it's hard. It's not to say it's easy. So, but that if you are dealing with a smaller population and smaller agencies, you still, what's interesting is you still have all of the same things. Like you're still really siloed. You still have this department that doesn't talk to that department, and this agency that like nobody knows what they're doing, and this agency that will only use Word and Excel and won't like touch anything else. But although you have that at the federal level, it's at like such a massive scale that just the projects shake out a little bit differently, and the scope of what you can get done, I think, shakes out a little bit differently. Sarah, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. So I have to admit, I was last in government in the federal level, but my heart is at the city and local level, and I started at the city of New Orleans. One of the things I will say is, to echo Hana, the impact that you can have at the city level is tremendous, and it's often much more visible because it's directly in your community. So when you are, say, working on blight and you are traveling through blight every day to get to work, or if you are fixing 311 services and then are actually using them yourself, or people are coming up to you, you can see that impact. And I would say that's both external and internal, when you can wander around and actually make some of those human connections across agencies within, it's easier to do in many instances at the city level. But I think some of the challenges remain the same for both. So you will see fear on both sides of, for example, starting by going out and talking to users, and every civic technologist, public interest technologist, problem solver with a kind of design background that I think a lot of the folks in this audience have will say, you got to start with you have to go talk to folks and say, what problems are you actually having, so that we can make sure that we're actually trying to solve real problems in ways that meet people where they are, not where we think they are. That can be extraordinarily scary at every level. And so figuring out the morass of policies and politics to get that kind of work done is consistent across.
How do you do that? I mean, that's really interesting, right? So how do you do that? How do you become to some extent, you have to become a policy expert, right? Look, there's a benefit to some extent, right? And I see this in my work as well. You come into a brand new industry, for example, where you know nothing about it. And so you ask all the stupid questions. Why is it like this? Why is it like that? But at some point, right, the policies really matter, right? And so how do you get up to speed on that? Or that's my question.
So I'm going to take this in a couple of different directions. Jen Palka, who founded Code for America, has a great saying about water cooler policies versus actual policies. So one thing is actually literally when you will hear very often when change comes, it can be really scary, because upgrading some kind of process for folks that have been running that process for a long time in their head often translates to, I will no longer have a job if this person does what they say they're going to do. And so that is often a creation of space of what we call water cooler policies, i.e. I'm not allowed to do that. And you have to sort of gently say, I totally understand. Could you show me where that's written down?
Wow.
But actually, like understanding, sitting down at the table with policymakers, having technologists at the table from the get-go, so they're both learning from each other, is a huge part of very much the most recent kind of iteration of this movement. So that we're starting to build, for example, policies. When we build something like a healthcare.gov as a policy, we're thinking through the technology implementation. The second thing I will say, to quote a friend who actually I think is on this webinar, is lawyers can be your friend. And it is actually incredibly helpful, particularly at the federal level, to think about your team as more than technologists. So that is your procurement experts, that is your legal people, that is folks who might not sound like they came from Silicon Valley, but in fact are going to be critical for you moving through the red tape style bureaucracy to actually be able to make product style change.
Got it. And how often does it happen where you say something like, hey, can you show me where that's written down? And then that person realizes that, we've been doing it all this way for years, and we don't have to do it that way. Does that happen a lot?
I would say that happens constantly.
Okay.
People are not used to, this kind of goes back to the point about it being about leadership and coming from the top. I think a lot of people in government are not used to challenging the common assumptions about how work is done simply because they haven't had the space to do it. So I have been working closely with a local government lately, and a lot of the time people will say, oh, well, we can't get this data because there are legal implications. And I said, well, so we should get a lawyer on the project team. And they were like, ooh, that's a cool idea. So
Yeah.
it's not that people don't want to challenge things. It's just that like the default response is, oh, well, we can't do that.
I think one thing I would just add to that, Hannah's completely agree. If you take a job, I'm going to go to procurement for a minute. There's a ton of civil servants all over across the country who have been told for years and years that they can't innovate in a whole bunch of different ways, structurally and otherwise. Procurement's a great example. If you take like a business practice, like a key performance indicator, the KPI for procurement for a very long time has been compliance, as it should, as one of them should be, but it has not been, say, delivering joyful and easy services, which ideally would be another one, but that's never how they've been evaluated. They've never had the opportunity to make a business case or otherwise that this is a different way of doing things because this is a result we should be looking for. And so to Hannah's point, having that leadership from the top that makes that air cover, that says to not just new people, but people who have been there and been itching to do things differently for a really long time, hey, like you have permission and air cover and safety to move forward and try to do something differently than before. It's scary in government. Like you get in the paper if you do something wrong and you mess up people's taxpayer money. So there's a huge risk that people kind of live with every day, and it can really dull down the desire to try to make some kind of big or small change.
Amazing. Amazing. All right, let's dive into some of these participant questions. So a statement to react to, as opposed to a question, I assume. The complexity, I'm not me, but the question asker, the complexity I'm running into is the number of contractors and subcontractors that all need to be marching together to make change. I'm finding it nearly impossible. What have you both seen in trying to build alignment and direction and focus amongst all of these contractors and subcontractors?
So that is definitely a challenge across the board. We have seen people or cities doing a couple different approaches for that. In New York City, they recently, and this is probably not going to solve your current problem, but may help prevent some future problems. They opened up a new, basically, procurement avenue for design, where they were able to invite new people to bid on a future design contract, which in the way that they've structured it allows basically a new set of pre-approved vendors and contractors to easily be pulled from. So these are people who are kind of already aligned with modern practices. It's definitely for sure a roadblock when you are dealing with a vendor who has, and I dealt with this at the federal level, when you're locked into a vendor contract that goes for the next 5 years and they're not going to do anything. I don't know that in some cases, I will say at the federal level, that was enough of a cause to say like, okay, we're going to hold off on that piece and try to do other stuff. In other places, we, I don't think we talk about this in the book, but we have written about it. In Seattle, they were able to redesign the way that they procured their vendors for homeless services and to make it essentially results-based, and data accountable, which it hadn't been before. It had just been like, are you functioning? So, a lot of people who are rewriting procurements to include metrics, again, doesn't solve your current problem, but could prevent future problems.
So what I'm hearing really is that there's so much opportunity for improvement that if it's just too messy over here, we'll just go over here. Just try it.
I mean, I think that that's a fair way to put it. That like there is a lot of stuff. There are so many. We don't lack for problems.
Yeah.
So in some cases, you don't want to beat your head against a wall. And Sarah talked about the fact that a lot of people are leaving, and I think it's this work is really hard, and you are constantly running up against, oh, okay, that's not going to work. Let me try over here. Okay, that's not going to work. Let me go over here. And one thing actually that we have talked about in the past is when it's time to quit. So if there is a piece where you simply cannot get people aligned, they're like into these like silly contracts that you didn't have anything to do with, and now you're sort of at the mercy of them, that it might be time to look for some other way in.
Three things I would just add quickly on the question around contractors, which, as Hana said, like it is all over the place. And I want to preface this with like a huge, I feel like that we all feel this pain. And also I'm going to make a couple suggestions that totally in the dark of knowing anything about your people and processes. So they may be non-starters. Three things that I have seen in the past. One is having the buck stops here leader. Decision maker stops here. As long as you have multiple chains of command, at some point every single decision gets run up all the way to the top, and the top two have to speak, and they never have time, so decisions get drawn out every 6 months, and it's just terrible for everybody. So whenever possible, if there can be, whether it's a civil servant or not, like the buck stops here that everybody reports into, just to kind of streamline. The second is, if you're not using Agile, even if you can pick up something that's akin to some of the practices, like a stand-up that is a daily check-in that starts to create structure around we are all working on the same thing together and we're all accountable in a very transparent way, because then it becomes less around you're a part of this contracting team and you're part of this contracting team, but rather we're all part of the same project. And then the third part of that is actually, it's the people management side. So it is actually, how do you create that culture where people are thinking of themselves not as contractors or individuals who are working in their own silos, but working together, and sometimes actually building that team culture, that team camaraderie, the sense of we're all aligned and moving towards this greater purpose that we all really care about, can help overcome some of the challenges that can come up just through, I don't report to you, so I don't have to listen to you.
Right. Got it. Good. Look, we've talked a lot about procurement, and I know that pain in industry. I can't imagine it in government. But let me ask you this. So, a question here from one of our participants: with regard to procurement, how much is attributed to whoever owns the funding for a specific project? With the context being, this participant said he experienced analogous problems working at a hedge fund, where only the ones that benefited most from a specific initiative wanted to fund it. Others didn't want to provide money to shared infrastructure or services. There's similar kind of challenges when it comes to procurement and government.
So that's an interesting one. I would say some of the challenges with procurement come with some of it is figuring out like where you're going to actually allocate funds into what, but then some of it is actually like, how are you going to do it? So the analogy that you will hear fairly often is we buy, every time we try to buy something in government, it's like we're buying a battleship that doesn't exist yet and takes 10 years to spec out. And 10 years later, at the speed that the country, that the world is moving right now, you have an entirely new like world of problems, and the battleship is completely irrelevant, but you've spent $2 billion on it. Mm-hmm. So one of the problems is not so much getting people aligned around, do we need something, but how are we actually going to physically go out in procurement? There's been really important work done by 18F at the federal level by folks like Code for America and across a bunch of different local governments around how do we actually take bite-size big problems and take bite sizes of them and do modular procurement so that we're actually putting little bits of money in. To the hedge point thing, when you can start to show small snowballing success, then it's easier to get more funding coming into it. And you can also pivot faster and say, oh, okay, this part didn't work, but what we didn't do is spend $1 billion, we spent 100,000, and now we know which direction we need to go to spend the next 100,000.
And do you see people saying, especially if something is starting to pick up steam, will they take ownership for it? Say, oh, I funded that thing that's now doing well. Is there anything like that, or is it?
I don't know that we saw anything exactly like that. I mean, obviously, when something is successful, people want to take ownership of it.
Sure.
I do think that Sarah's point about modular contracting is important to come back to, though. I mean, when you don't have an enormous procurement, the funding is a different conversation. It's not $1 billion contract all of a sudden. So that also allows people to feel like they can take a little bit more of a risk.
Got it. Okay. Question. If step one is for leadership to buy in and champion this type of work, what happens if they don't?
Yes, I saw that question. It's a great question with, I think, a sad answer, which is that, as I said, we didn't see anybody who was successful at changing hearts and minds when it came to having a digital innovation team. It's kind of like either you get it and you see the value or you don't. So we did talk to a lot of people who were desperately trying, and in some cases were able to like be funded for multiple years, but you know, you need that cover. You need somebody at the top who is going to stand up for you when there are the inevitable failures. You need somebody who provides you the breathing room. You need someone who is going to champion you when you do cross-agency stuff, which drives everybody crazy and says, you know, we're not going to do it. You need to be able to say, well, actually, the mayor says we are, or whoever it is. If you don't have that, it's not that. I think small things are still possible if you don't have that, but the big change and the big cultural change is just, it becomes very, very, very challenging. One thing that we haven't talked about is that we have seen that this work grows by exposure, which is one of the reasons that we wanted to do this research and tell these stories, because we have found that, you know, Chicago may see something that, you know, Denver did and be like, well, why don't we have that in Chicago? Mm-hmm. That may be enough to change leadership's mind. You know, giving those stories, giving them a book like this is another reason, you know, part of the reason that we wrote this is to start to say, like, look, it doesn't have to be like really expensive, really complicated, really hard. This can be simple, but it's that mindset. So the leadership really does have to be aligned in what this is going to look like and, you know, some of the risks involved.
1000%. I think three things just to think about on that. So the ideal scenario is you have a proactive leader who has seen something and said, I want that. And then also when you get there says, tell me how it is we should do this, versus I want this thing that Denver has and I want it exactly the same. But either way, like having the proactive is ideal. Unfortunately, the second way that people most often find themselves kind of having an opening is the firefighting. Something goes terribly wrong. An alarm goes across, you know, Hawaii that says that, you know, whatever, the healthcare.gov crashes, like there's some kind of major malfunction in a way that government then responds and says, we need to do things differently. The third one is convincing by showing instead of telling. And I just want to pause on that for a minute, particularly for folks who are already in government. One of my favorite stories actually is from somebody that we worked with who she had the oversight from like high up, but not within her agency. And she just wasn't trusted. And a huge part of it is actually building that trust inside the agency with the people who maybe even if they're not at the top, they're the one who like can give you access to the mainframe, for example. And she, rather than trying to do something totally big, she just kind of wandered around for a while and started to identify problems. And one of them was faxes that came in that the handwriting was illegible. And so she just made a type form and she made it available. And she didn't, and they were like, we don't want to have to use this. She said, that's totally fine. But what started to come in was people, of course, were like, great, I don't have to handwrite something and then try to find a printer and a scanner and then fax it to you. And they started typing it, and all of a sudden they could actually read things much more legibly. And so then it was people, you know, within the department saw that they were getting hours and hours of their time back, and also having to buy much less Excedrin because of the migraines of trying to figure out people's handwriting, and kind of looked at her and went, okay, wait, what else can you do? Like, how else can you fix my life? And so then there started to be some steamrolling from within, where there was trust building, and it was, okay, this person isn't going to come break things. They could actually come help us make things happen.
Got it. I love this next question. It's near and dear to my heart as someone who focuses a lot on behavior as a measure of success. And so Julia wants to know, what are some of the most prevalent and useful metrics for innovation in government? She's been hearing about an increased focus on assessing impact, and she's curious about the ways to do that, particularly as we move towards more innovation by collaboration coaching rather than product delivery. How do you measure the success of this stuff? We don't.
We don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. So I didn't know if Sarah was going to take it or not. Sorry. So this also, I feel like every answer is like, so this is also challenging, which we did talk about this being a little bit of group therapy. I think part of why I'm struggling a little bit to answer is because that's very broad. Obviously there are some projects, I mean, I just mentioned this homelessness project in Seattle where they were able to set metrics around how many people were actually moving. I think before it had been just how many people they were getting into shelters, but they moved it down to how many people are actually moving from a shelter, moving out of shelters and into permanent housing. So that sounds really obvious, but it's in government, it's kind of revelatory that you would look at a metric as being not just like, did we do our job, but did we do the thing that we're contracted to do, but like, was the final outcome the thing that we were working toward? I will say in some cases, if you can get any metrics in place, you are ahead.
Yeah.
I have worked with, especially at the federal level, people who just like didn't really understand why they would want to be tracking metrics. Again, it's that whole concept of like that not really understanding that you're in the service delivery business and thinking that your mission is, well, you know, our mission is to do X and we did X, and whether we did X well, whether it had the intended result, So yeah, I think that if you're even like having the metrics conversation, you're already ahead.
And I'll add a couple of things to that. So this is obviously a huge problem. And I will say that this ties also to the question of what does success look like? Because when we measure outcomes with, when we're looking for outcomes that don't actually match to what success truly is, that's often where we see the disconnect between the media or leadership and folks on the ground. And so that means that we have to be flexible and often like show leadership. Along with the civic tech or whatever we're calling it movement, there's been a real push for open data and transparent data and government transparency. And that has actually provided a lot of helpful kind of infrastructure as well around being able to understand even what is the baseline of where we are right now as a government service. And I'm going to take a specific example that was from my times in New Orleans. When we built out NOLA.gov, we had normal metrics that we put into place for the first time. We actually put analytics, you know, behind the content management system, so we could actually say, you know, where are people coming from, and how long are they staying, and we could start to measure the bounce rate is going down, et cetera. But we also we were a boisterous team of two, and we also used some more maybe less familiar metrics than some folks might say. So we actually had a measurement was how many people are saying F you online to us. Because that was actually like, we would get so many comments on the old website because everything was broken. So we were measuring everything from like, and I have done a presentation of like how we in 2 years reduced the number of people saying F you online by 95%. That was a very important metric because it's not just about like people are coming to the website. It also means that we're not pissing them off, excuse my language, once they get there.
Yeah, no, that's a win. That's terrific. And look, it's a good metric, right? I mean, you're right, yeah, and you're measuring behavior, you're measuring public frustration. It means you're delivering value, right? If people are, not telling you to F off, that's a good sign, I would guess. Yeah. Hey, Dana's got a question. You guys know Dana. I know Dana. Yes. Dana says she hears from a lot of people who are very early in their careers who want desperately to break into PIT. What are your thoughts about that? And maybe you can tell us what PIT is as well. That would be great.
Yes, public interest technology.
Thank you. Okay.
So this is another area, Sarah was talking about the different pieces of building out the field and building out a community, and that there's sort of a lack of obvious career tracks in this field. I actually feel like at least weekly, but maybe even more, I have conversations with people who don't know what the next logical step is in their career. We, at the moment, don't do a wonderful job of bringing entry-level people in. Many of the positions are mid-level or senior level, in part because a lot of these initiatives are so new that they're starting, top down. One of the things that we have been working on at New America is to create a pipeline from the universities. So training more public policy students in technology, and also opening up the possibility to computer science students that a career in government or the public sector is actually a really interesting thing that you can do with a computer science degree. That work is still beginning. I think that part of the work that needs to be done is to make government attractive to people who otherwise are like, I want to go work at Instagram. And to compete with that is a challenge, but I think that we found that, we talked about this a little bit before, that the people who are in government, sorry, my cat is making a cameo. People who are in government care really, really deeply, and we're seeing sort of a renewed wave of activism and community engagement and community involvement. And I think that if government can get its act together on a few smaller levels, we haven't even talked about hiring, but some teams have found some really interesting workarounds for the fact that you might be hiring somebody a year out. Like another challenge to bringing in entry-level people is telling them they have to wait a year or take a civil service test. But the more that we can share stories about really interesting things, good government things that are happening, and why this is a place where you can have a really interesting and challenging career. And the other piece is that I think that teams should actively look to create entry-level positions. So we spend a lot of time, as I said, when a team is starting up, bringing in somebody at a high level and looking for, the rock star person who's going to come in. But it's so important to also be opening up the field to people who are just getting started.
Yep. We've got 5 minutes left. I'm going to try to get at least one, hopefully 2 more questions, because there's tons of them. And I know we're not going to get to all of them, but I'll definitely share them with you, and you can feel free to answer them at another time. So Jason wants to know, he says, look, one of your slides talked about innovation being lonely. Our city has recently formed an innovation department with 1 employee. Any tips to building a team like this at the local level? We're doing our best to build an innovation team made up of lots of different departments, but how do you build this team on an ROI perspective on fixed budgets?
Yes. So. And I'm going to jump right into this, because every government job I have had has started off with me being by myself, except you are never by yourself, because it's not about org chart, it's about finding your people. So the first thing I want to say is there's innovation happening all across the government. And I started in Homeland Security and found my people in IT and in waste management and in public works and in the police office and in EMS. And we were doing emergency response, and we became the innovator folks, not because we worked together officially, but because we unofficially found our people and said, okay, how can we say to ourselves, what is working right now isn't working, so how do we do it a different way? Fixed budgets are real, org charts are real, but I will say that when you can start to think around, if everybody is thinking about their hiring, how do you structure hiring positions so that you are actually giving people some space to do some things that are innovative across agencies? Because at the end of the day, people, when they're trying to get a government service delivery, rarely is the case that they are only touching one agency. Like if you think about something like a parking ticket, whatever, you're going through public works and you're going through police and you might be going through courts and you might be going through, there's 5 or 6 different agencies. So starting to think about building those teams that are cross-functional with people you already have or roles that are being hired. So if somebody's hiring a user researcher somewhere or a designer type person, then maybe if somebody else is hiring, say, an engineer, there might be some partnerships, even though they're not in the same place.
I think those are great suggestions. I would also add that that person might want to think about attaching themselves to an agency quickly, because first of all, being a separate innovation department and also just being one person sounds really, really hard. So we have seen a lot of innovation teams that are embedded within a larger agency, and those tend to work well if they're working on projects that are really important to that agency, if they're working on priority projects. So I would try to find the agency that seems the most open to innovation and likely to welcome this person with open arms, and get a few quick wins in that agency and sort of like prove your value and grow from there.
Perfect. Thank you. Folks, we are going to run out of time here. So before we wrap up, first of all, I wanted to say a huge thank you to Sarah and Hannah for the great tips, the presentation, and everything. We've got a ton of unanswered questions, so I'll share those with you, and you can feel free to tweet about them, blog about them at your leisure. It's been amazing. I saw Sarah's comment in the chat too. It's been amazing to watch all of the howdies in the chat from the different groups and the different offices saying hi. It's nice to know that there's a bunch of teams watching here as well. I will close with this. Again, we're recording this, so this is going to go up on Sense and Respond Press's YouTube channel within a week. I will remind you that Sarah and Hannah do have a new book out called The Government Fix. You can find it at senseandrespondpress.com or at amazon.com as well. Thanks very much for spending an hour with us. I hope you found it valuable. Thanks for a great presentation. And we'll see you all next time, yeah? All right. Bye, folks. See you later.